Distinguished colleagues, esteemed guests, online viewers, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this presentation. It gives me great pleasure to present and discuss my research, or what has felt like my life's work, on the topic of disaster response evaluations. Although I did not plan this type of disputation when I started my research some years ago, it is a significant day from various reasons. For example, we are in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic, a worldwide crisis with interesting characteristics and opportunities. I therefore think that the timing for presenting my research might be kind of right, as probably many evaluations will follow the response to this pandemic, but more about these evaluations later in this presentation when I discuss my findings. Despite these opportunities, this pandemic also imposed some significant limitations. That means I'm very happy to have even a reduced live audience to present to. And thanks to the rapid adaptation of alternative technical solutions, an even larger audience online. Before going into the details of my research, its performance and findings, I would like to take you back in time and start with a short film. This represents the personal starting point, the trigger of my research in this area. EU FloodX was my first real-life acquaintance with a large-scale disaster simulation, a flood response in the Netherlands. As a newcomer, I was involved in the design process for the exercise evaluation. I provided support across the entire range of evaluation design stages: the start, the execution, analysis, and reporting of the evaluation. This evaluation formed a large, costly, and significant part of this European exercise project, particularly as it was one of the first. Since then, I have become increasingly involved in disaster response evaluations, both simulated and real, so my research is connected to real-life practice. I saw, not only in research but also in real life, that the evaluations and their products are used for a variety of purposes and by a range of users. During the broadening of my involvement, I posed an internal question. Do the evaluations actually achieve their purposes, and are they actually recognized as useful? Do they really leave the response organizations better prepared to respond to future disasters or crises as a result of conducting and following up evaluations? And can these evaluations actually be used for this purpose? Starting my research, I found that many issues concerning broad topics such as communications, coordination, and collaboration are repeatedly reported in evaluations. Also, the first part of my research taught me that many types of evaluation designs were being implemented, and that many evaluations were regarded in isolation and perceived as one-time standalone events. Additionally, there appeared to be a lack of detail regarding the data collection and evaluation methodology used. Knowing all this, proposed the question: how can we improve evaluations so they can deliver a more useful and qualitative contribution to preparedness or response? My personal experiences, practical input, and initial research outcomes were the drivers to conduct a PhD research project to identify answers to these and other related questions. Luckily, I was supported by Dutch practice, with which, as an employee of the Institute for Safety of the Netherlands, I am familiar with. So, having explained a little bit more about the why of this research, now it is time to talk about the what. I will briefly explain the key concepts that formed the building blocks central to this thesis: disaster risk management, or in short DRM, and evaluation. First, I will introduce the concept of disaster risk management. Preparing for and responding to disasters, simulated or real, can be related to the process of managing risks. Risk in this context can be related to protecting something that we as humans value, and in order to do so, it has to deal with uncertainty, severity, and consequences. Following this logic, risk can be reduced by, for example, lowering the likelihood of an unwanted event by prevention, or by managing the severity of any consequences by preparing and responding to them. This is exactly what emergency or disaster organizations or systems are trying to achieve. But at the same time, they also need to deal with uncertainty. Here, the next concept, evaluation, comes into play. Evaluation can be seen as a systematic assessment that determines the value or performance of an emergency actor with respect to the attendant purposes and the match between expected and actual outcomes in any given scenario. Or, in short, evaluations can support determining whether an emergency response met expected performance criteria or could be further developed or improved. Besides referring to a process of evaluation, the product of this assessment process is also referred to as evaluation. Evaluation as a whole can thus be seen as a means or tool for measuring actual outcomes against expectations. The insights it collects through the evaluation process and are shared by the evaluation products can help to reduce uncertainty, as it provides evidence and measured information about actual outcomes and their effect on reduction of the likelihood and severity of consequences in any disaster. A key element of success in both DRM and evaluations are use and users. These determine whether an evaluation will be able to make an impact. If the expectations and/or needs from these users are not met, even the best evaluation can be shelved as another useless product, not having any impact on the previously introduced DRM processes. So a user-focused, well-constructed and well-managed evaluation process should be seen as key to collecting useful, evidence-based feedback in order to determine the effectiveness of preparedness and response activities. Fortunately, large-scale disasters, emergencies or crises do not happen every day. Therefore, we simulate them in exercises. The response in these exercises, that ideally mirror reality, can then be evaluated. Doing this also forms an important strategy to improve disaster risk management and reduce uncertainty, and in turn reduce the loss of lives and resources during a real event. As you might have noticed now, I have answered the why and what questions related to this research. This is also in line with the design approach underlying this research. So now it is time to go into the details of how the research project was performed and what its key findings were to support the problem-solving nature of a design approach. As you can see on the overview on this slide, the research project can be roughly divided into 4 steps that used a mixed research design. Partially, this research was conducted in the Netherlands as a case. I will use these steps and related research questions to guide you through my research. Because conducting research can be seen as standing on the shoulders of giants, it started by mapping the existing published scientific literature in order to find out what research already has been undertaken and to identify a clear route for the next research steps. I used an extended scoping study methodology. This approach was complemented by an in-depth analysis of the content and a consultation exercise. The aim was to systematically provide a comprehensive overview of research that already has been conducted in the field of disaster exercise evaluation. Analyzing a considerable number of research papers, I identified that only a very limited amount of literature focused specifically on this topic. Thus little was on record regarding the evaluation of disaster management exercises. Most interest in the wider topic is in the medical domain, followed by the social sciences and engineering. I started to wonder if this was a significant gap. A further analysis of the literature identified 4 groups with various foci. It was also found that many research and evaluative efforts are descriptive and do not build upon each other. This can have serious consequences for building a solid knowledge base or identifying if lessons identified actually have become lessons learned. On the methodological side of things, it was also found that there is little or no evidence of the effectiveness of the methods applied. For example, why is a certain evaluation design and method chosen, and how does this relate to the purpose it is trying to achieve? Without this information, how can we determine the value or utility of the evaluation in a broader context? Fortunately, the data also showed that the field is gaining interest. The first step of my research provided a general understanding that there is little evidence regarding how evaluations are conducted, how and why they are used to achieve their purpose and their effectiveness. In essence, one could question their usefulness and value or utility for professionals. Because the first step focused on research literature, it was also good to see how actual practice was delivering evaluations. In the next step, I focused on looking into Dutch evaluation practice. What evaluations are performed in the Netherlands? How are they structured? What common aspects are deemed important in these evaluations? In order to find answers to these questions, a document analysis was performed of evaluations reports and supporting documents coming from exercises, emergencies, and so-called systemic tests. This analysis was complemented with expert judgment by a group of representatives from the Dutch safety regions. As may be expected, because the Netherlands consists of 25 safety regions, the research showed that a variety of contexts, purposes, and uses can be identified. This is also reflected in the design, which showed that there is a lack of detail regarding the reasoning behind the evaluation designed. The only exception to this are the systemic tests, but they have other shortcomings. This makes it difficult to assess the quality, usefulness, and effectiveness of evaluations. What purpose are they trying to achieve and how is this done? Sometimes this purpose is not clearly stated. Practice confirmed what was found in the research literature: a scattered field of unrelated evaluations hampering learning or development. Evaluations are in practice also seen as standalone or independent, not building upon each other incrementally, across a series or range of exercises to ensure the lessons identified in one scenario or organization become lessons learned for all. There was also no significant cross-mapping between the outcomes of simulations and their likely effects in live disaster events. Also, the various contexts and/or events do not show any linkages. For example, what was learned from an exercise on power outage and how does this relate to a real power outage? Or were the lessons identified in exercise improved when looking at the evaluation of the systemic tests? The findings in this first part of the research showed that it's unclear how the ease of use of an evaluation product can be quantified. It is challenging to provide the users, whoever that may be, with information in the most accessible format in order to achieve a purpose. This finding is used as a basis for the second half of this research. This element is focused on the usefulness of evaluations for crisis management professionals. It was split up in a more quantitative part, investigating influence of various components on usefulness for various purposes, and a more qualitative part, focuses on user expectations. The quantitative part used a survey experiment using realistically constructed vignettes or text descriptions based on actual evaluation reports. This was done in order to determine to what extent crisis management professionals believe that a specific format of evaluation description enhances its ability to achieve its purpose. The experiment introduced and also used the notion of an evaluation description. This notion was inspired by the previous part of this research. For the survey experiment, this notion consisted of 4 components: purpose, P, object description, O, analysis, A, and conclusion, C. In particular, this study aimed to gain insights into whether O, A, and C influence the usefulness of an evaluation report with respect to its P. Without going into the analytical details of a multi-level analysis that was performed, this research showed that the way emergency exercise evaluations are documented is important and directly affects their usefulness. Different components are more or less important for the usefulness, depending on the purpose of the report. Specifically, the usefulness of an evaluation for learning purposes is improved when its analysis and conclusions are clearly recorded and stated. This implies that evaluations should provide information about what happened and how, and why this was the case. In contrast, evaluations used for accountability purposes are only improved by the clarity of the conclusion. Here they should focus on providing a judgment, outcome, or result with regard to the evaluated performance. The evaluation description introduced in this third study offers evaluation professionals and research a way to make evaluations more useful for their users. The components of this evaluation description, POAC, were also found in the second part of this study. which was aimed at identifying user expectations. In this part, crisis professionals or stakeholders who would use evaluations in their work were questioned in order to gain a better understanding of what they expect from a useful evaluation report and what it should contain. Here, an adapted stakeholder information analysis was used to answer this question. It was found that in particular the purpose formed a clear basis for designing evaluations and presenting results. Mostly, evaluations are expected to contribute to learning or development. But if this is not the case, blaming and scapegoating should be avoided. In addition to the survey experiment, the respondents highlighted the importance of the object of the evaluation. Each object might require a different evaluation approach. For example, humans versus tools. The first might require a more qualitative and open conversational approach, while the latter might be more quantitative, aimed at measuring. Following the object description, respondents noted that analyses should be rigorous, go beyond the individual, and adopt a broad, system-wide perspective, taking into account the context an evaluation is performed in. These findings about expectations also create challenges for the so-called rigor relevance gap, which is also to be found in evaluation reports. Finally, they also had expectations regarding a fifth element, the design of the evaluation product. So how the product of an evaluation should be presented in order to be actionable. Now the various underlying research steps and their findings have been discussed. I will finalize this presentation by using them as a basis for my reflection and applying a broader perspective, conceptualizing and simultaneously answering what we need to consider when improving the usefulness of disaster response evaluations. But before moving into some points for discussion, I would like to highlight that this research focused on formal evaluations. It must be remembered that these evaluations are not the only evaluations that are being performed during disaster responses. Many informal and invisible evaluations are being performed as well, not delivering any formal or even tangible products, but still influencing future behavior and thus leading to change. It will be challenging to identify and assimilate these evaluations, but their impact should not be underestimated, and future work should focus on collecting and using and sharing them. So that having said, there is a lot of work to be done with regards to improving the usefulness of formal evaluation. A key aspect in this improvement is involving end users to jointly determine their quality and success. In particular, the evaluation quality is something that is related to usefulness. Users should be better able to set requirements that help to determine the credibility, value, accuracy, and usefulness of evaluations. This is something that needs to be considered when designing evaluations and the process underlying them. This process should support what is called evaluative reasoning, which can be found in the evaluation description displayed on the screen. Here also evaluators can play an important role. Furthermore, I think good evaluation can contribute to positive developments in disaster risk management in at least three key ways. Firstly, it can contribute by sharing findings, lessons learned, or lessons to be learned. Secondly, it can contribute by initiating meta-evaluation. Good evaluations can be used to compare similar skill and delivery requirements across a range of exercises or even across a range of areas and organizations. These in turn can provide input for managing risks and identifying trends. Thirdly, it can contribute to increasing professionalism by addressing the real problems and arrive at reliable conclusions. Evaluation should be seen as an honest attempt to reflect actions and processes during a real or simulated event. A first step might be looking at the role of evaluations from a broader perspective, using cycles and loops for controlling risks and managing disasters. Now, there is one model that I would bring to the table here as an example which illustrates the cyclic nature and relationship between simulated and real events, and the role of evaluation in, for example, reducing uncertainty. That model is shown on the slide, and I will briefly explain it to you. The figure shows that the model is based on two loops that are bound together by the disaster response system. This illustrates that preparedness and response should not be seen as two separate things, but having a close relationship which is operationalized within the disaster response system. The left loop illustrates the role of evaluation with regards to preparedness activities, such as exercises or simulated events. As these events or activities are planned for, here there is, for example, much more control about the selection of the scenario and the participants that take part. The right loop illustrates the role of evaluation during real responses, where there is much more uncertainty of how things work out as they are difficult to plan. Here the event and how it unfolds influences the response capacity and how they perform. Both loops also include smaller loops. These loops illustrate informal evaluations that also take place during these events. The focus here is, however, on the big formal loop, which shows that on an abstract level, evaluation is similar in both events. Its focus is to identify how the response went, or more precisely, what went well and what can be improved. This loop also shows the relationship with the outcomes of this research, such as POAC, as a basis for demonstrating where improvements can be made. Finally, the model also shows that evaluation and its outcomes and products can also be shared amongst various other disaster response systems. This can help to stimulate wider development and learning. The system should not operate in isolation, and it must be able to adapt itself to the evolving context it is part of. Evaluation can support and practice adaptation as it provides feedback on skills or knowledge-based delivery. It then also needs to ensure that the collected information or the evaluation is shared by using useful evaluation products. It then really makes an effort to help us become better prepared for the next event. So to end my presentation, I want to point out that my enthusiasm about this topic might give the impression that evaluation is the solution or holy grail, and that if we solve this, all our problems are solved. Unfortunately, this is not the case. Evaluation is a means that, amongst others, can deliver a contribution to improving disaster risk management, as long as it is used. It is a continuous process, and I would like to encourage both science as well as practice to continue further develop evaluation and their products, as it offers great potential in supporting the future of disaster risk management by building a solid knowledge base and support evidence-based learning. Evaluation provides insights into the effectiveness of current practice, identify weaknesses, and propose improvements, all delivering support in order to learn from the past and be better prepared for the next disaster, whatever that may be.